The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the iron rails was a sound that had worked its way into Aoife Callahan's bones over the last week. It was a monotonous, soul-wearying sound, the beat of a drum marching her toward a future she could not picture. The train car was a rolling box of misery, thick with the cloying smells of coal smoke that seeped through every crack, the sour sweat of unwashed bodies pressed too close, and the faint, sweet rot of cheap whiskey on some man's breath 3 rows back. It was an atmosphere she had become grimly accustomed to, a smell that would forever be tied to this desperate pilgrimage into the unknown. She kept her gaze fixed out the grimy window, watching the world unspool itself. The last vestiges of the familiar were long gone. The rolling, impossibly green hills of Ohio and Illinois, which had at least whispered of her lost Ireland, had flattened and then given way to something else entirely. This land was vast and alien, a place that seemed to mock the very idea of human settlement. The sky was not the soft, cloud-dappled blue of her memory. It was immense, a pale, bleached-out dome that stretched to an infinite horizon, unforgiving in its sheer emptiness. Below it, the earth was a brutal canvas of sun-baked browns and dusty ochres, scarred with dry creek beds and punctuated by the stubborn, gray-green of sagebrush. In the far distance, a line of mountains rose like the broken teeth of some long-dead beast, jagged and menacing against the pale sky. This was not the gentle, rain-kissed land of her childhood, a place of small fields and stone walls, of soft mists and familiar voices. Nor was it the crowded, clamoring world of Boston, with its narrow brick streets and the ceaseless roar of industry. This was a place that felt ancient and utterly indifferent to the small, fleeting lives of people. It felt like a place that could swallow a person whole, leaving not so much as a shadow behind. A tremor of fear, cold and sharp, ran through her, a familiar companion on this journey. She quelled it with the same iron will that had brought her this far. Fear was a luxury. It did not fill an empty stomach or mend a broken spirit. Resolve was all that mattered. Her fingers tightened around the 2 objects in her lap. One was a small, leather-bound book of Irish poetry, its cover worn smooth and its pages softened by the hands of her mother, and her mother before her. It was the only tangible piece of her family she had left, a fragile link to the graves she had been forced to leave behind. The scent of the old paper and ink was a ghost of home, a painful comfort. The other object was a single sheet of crisp, folded paper. It was the letter from him, the man who had paid her passage, Elias Thorne. His name felt strange on her tongue, a collection of hard, foreign sounds. The letter was as stark and unforgiving as the landscape outside. It was short, practical, devoid of any warmth or welcome. "Miss Callahan," it read, in a surprisingly neat, deliberate hand. "Your passage is paid. The train will arrive at the redemption platform on the afternoon of October the 5th. I will be there." That was all. No word of greeting, no hint of the man who had summoned her across a continent. It was a business transaction, pure and simple, and she was the goods. She closed her eyes, the rhythmic rocking of the train pulling her back into the memories she was trying so desperately to outrun. She saw the gaunt, hollowed face of her mother, the life slowly fading from her eyes as the blight turned their small potato patch into a field of black, stinking rot. She felt the gnawing emptiness of her own belly, a constant, dull ache that had become the defining sensation of her youth. She remembered the treacherous sea voyage, the suffocating darkness of the steerage hold, the stench of sickness and despair, the terrifying, endless roll of the gray Atlantic. So many had not survived that crossing. She had. She had endured. Boston had been a different kind of hell. The promise of a new life had curdled into the reality of grueling 14-hour days in a textile mill, the air thick with cotton dust that coated her throat and lungs, the deafening clatter of the looms a constant assault on her senses. The pay was a pittance, barely enough to keep her in a cramped, cold room in a tenement teeming with other displaced souls. But even that she could have borne. It was Mr. Abernathy, the mill's foreman, who had been the final catalyst. A man with a wet, smiling mouth and hands that were always finding their way to the small of a girl's back, her arm, her shoulder. He had cornered her one evening as she was leaving, his breath sour with whiskey, his intentions brutally clear in his eyes. The raw terror of that moment, the feeling of being trapped, had ignited something in her. She had driven her knee into his groin with all the force she could muster and had fled into the night, never to return. That was the night she answered the advertisement in the newspaper. A mail-order bride, a rancher in the West, a chance for a piece of land, a roof over her head, a life away from the grasping hands of men like Abernathy. She was not seeking romance. The pretty stories of love and courtship were for other girls, girls who had not seen what she had seen. She was seeking sanctuary. She was a survivor, trading one bleak future for the possibility of another. This was her last, most desperate gamble, and she was playing with the only thing she had left to wager, herself. The train's whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that echoed across the empty plains. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels began to slow. Aoife's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a deep breath, tucked the letter into her poetry book, and clutched the small bundle that contained all her worldly possessions. She straightened her spine, pulling her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. She would not show fear. She would not show weakness. She would meet this unknown future on her feet. The train shuddered to a halt with a great hiss of steam. The conductor called out, "Redemption platform! Redemption!" in a voice thick with boredom. She stepped down from the car, her worn boots sinking into the loose gravel beside the tracks. And then she was alone. The train stop was little more than a weathered wooden platform and a skeletal water tower that stood stark against the sky. There was no station house, no ticket agent, no other soul in sight. The train, her last link to the world she knew, lingered for only a moment before its whistle shrieked again, and it began to pull away, gathering speed, its black smoke smudging the horizon until it was just a dark speck in the distance, and then it was gone. The silence that descended was absolute, oppressive. It was a living thing, broken only by the sound of the wind. The wind was a constant, physical presence, whipping strands of her dark red hair across her face and pulling at her thin shawl. It carried with it a fine, gritty dust that stung her eyes and coated her tongue. A profound sense of isolation washed over her, so potent it was almost dizzying. She stood on the splintered planks of the platform, a single, small figure in an immense and empty land. This was it, the edge of the world, just as a true, cold fear began to set in, a fear that whispered she had been abandoned, a fool for her desperate hope. She saw movement on the horizon. A wagon, pulled by two sturdy-looking horses, was making its way toward her, kicking up a trail of dust. As it drew closer, she could make out the figure of a man holding the reins. This must be him, Elias Thorne. He was not what she had pictured, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had been picturing. Some weathered older man, perhaps, lean and wiry like the land. The man who pulled the wagon to a stop before her was not old, but he was profoundly weathered. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a frame that spoke of immense physical strength, but he moved with a stiffness, and when he stepped down from the wagon, she saw the reason. He had a pronounced limp, his left leg dragging slightly as he walked. And then she saw his face. One side was a taut, twisted landscape of scar tissue that pulled the corner of his left eye and the edge of his mouth into a permanent, grim cast. It was a shocking, brutal injury, the kind a person might get from a fire or a war. His eyes, however, were another matter. They were a startlingly clear, pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and they watched her with an intensity that was deeply unnerving. He said nothing at first. He simply stood there, his gray eyes moving over her, from the worn toes of her boots to the tired lines on her face, appraising her with the slow, deliberate consideration a man might give a horse he was thinking of buying. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. It was more intimidating than any words of greeting or condemnation could ever have been. "Finally," he gestured with his head toward the back of the wagon. "Your things." he said. His voice was a low, rough baritone, a sound like stones grinding together. It was not unkind, merely devoid of inflection. "This is all I have," she said, her own voice sounding small and thin in the vast open space. She lifted her small bundle. He gave a single, curt nod and took it from her, tossing it into the wagon bed. He then moved to help her up, but hesitated, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he seemed to think better of it. He simply gestured to the wagon seat. She climbed up on her own, her skirts catching on a splintered board. He walked around to the other side, his limp more noticeable on the uneven ground, and pulled himself up beside her. He took up the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, the horses started forward. They left the lonely platform behind without a single backward glance. The journey to his ranch was long, and conducted in a near-total silence that was as vast and empty as the land they were crossing. The wagon had no springs to speak of, and it rattled and jolted over the rough, trackless terrain. Aoife had to hold on to the edge of the hard wooden seat to keep from being thrown off. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, but the beauty of it offered little comfort. The landscape became even more stark, more remote. It was a world of rock and dust and hardy, thorny plants she could not name. Elias Thorne did not try to make conversation. Twice. He pointed with a gloved hand toward a landmark. "Coyote Creek," he said, indicating a deep, dry ravine. Later, as they passed a towering, flat-topped butte that loomed black against the setting sun, he said, "Black Mesa." The curt, one-word descriptions were not invitations to talk. They were simple statements of fact. Aoife, sensing the deep, guarded reticence in him, a quiet as profound as the land itself, did not press him for more. Instead, she observed him. She watched his hands, his good right hand and the scarred, slightly twisted left one. They were calloused and powerful, and they handled the reins with an expert, gentle care that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. His gaze was never still. It constantly scanned the horizon, moving from the distant mountains to the clumps of sagebrush, reading the land like a language she did not understand. She saw the tension in the set of his broad shoulders, the deep lines of weariness etched around his clear gray eyes. He was a man walled off from the world, a fortress of solitude and pain, and she was about to be locked inside with him. Her fear, which had been a cold knot in her stomach, began to mix with a surprising, unwelcome flicker of empathy. This was a man marked by hardship, just as she was. His wounds were on the outside, plain for all the world to see. Hers were on the inside, hidden but no less deep. They arrived at the ranch as the last light of dusk was bleeding from the sky. It was a lonely, windswept place that seemed to cling precariously to the vast emptiness surrounding it. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and grass, looking more like a temporary shelter against the elements than a home. A larger, dilapidated barn stood nearby, its roof sagging in the middle. A few corrals, fashioned from rough timber, completed the settlement. The entire place felt functional, stark, and utterly devoid of comfort or beauty. There were no flowers, no painted shutters, no sign of a woman's touch. It was the physical manifestation of the man who owned it, scarred, isolated, and built for endurance rather than joy. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the cabin and set about the necessary chores with an economy of motion that wasted no energy. He unhitched the horses, led them to a trough, and then into the barn. Aoife slid down from the wagon seat, her legs stiff and her body aching from the long journey. She stood awkwardly in the dirt, her small bundle clutched in her hands, unsure of her role, of where she was meant to go. She felt like a stray dog, waiting for a command from its new master. He finally emerged from the barn and limped toward the cabin, stopping at the door and looking at her. "Well," he said, the single word a clear instruction. She hurried forward and stepped past him into the cabin. The inside was as Spartan as the outside. It was clean, she noted with some relief, but bare to the point of austerity. A single room held everything: A large stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and black. A rough wooden table with two straight-backed chairs stood in the center of the room. A single bed with a thin mattress and a patched quilt was tucked into one corner. In the opposite corner was a small, narrow cot. There were no curtains on the two small windows, no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floorboards. There was no sign of a life lived here, only of a life endured. Elias came in behind her, the small space suddenly crowded by his presence. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Without a word, he went to the hearth, built a fire with practiced speed, and put a pot of coffee on to boil. He then retrieved a tin plate from a shelf and placed it on the table, along with a piece of hardtack and a few strips of dried jerky. He gestured for her to sit. They ate in a silence that was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the scraping of their utensils against the tin plates. The chasm between them felt as vast and as cold as the prairie stretching out into the dark night. When the meager meal was finished, he cleared the plates. He moved to a small, locked chest in the corner and took out a worn leather pouch. He came back to the table and sat down opposite her, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his scarred face, making the damage seem deeper, more severe. He untied the pouch and tipped its contents onto the table. A few coins rolled out. He carefully counted them, his large fingers surprisingly nimble. Then he reached back into the pouch and took out a single, tarnished silver dollar. He pushed it across the rough surface of the table until it stopped in front of her. His clear gray eyes finally met hers, and his gaze was steady, unreadable. "That's the final dollar," he said, his voice quiet but rough. "For the agent, for the arrangement. It settles the account. The final payment. The transaction is complete. The moment was stripped of all humanity, raw and brutally commercial. She was a debt that had now been paid in full." Aoife stared at the dull gleam of the silver coin. It looked impossibly small, a paltry sum for such a monumental thing. She slowly raised her eyes from the coin to his scarred face, to the grim, unmoving line of his mouth. A wave of something, bitterness, defiance, a terrible, ironic humor rose in her throat. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, trembling but laced with a sharp edge of challenge. $1 for everything? The question hung in the air between them, thick with all the things it meant. Is this the price of my body, my future, my life? Is this all I am worth to you? His reaction was not what she had expected. He did not grow angry or defensive. He did not assert his dominance or claim the rights he had so clearly purchased. Instead, a deep, painful shame washed over his features. The hard certainty in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of something that looked like agony. His hands, the same hands she had seen handle the reins with such capable strength, began to shake. It was a fine, almost imperceptible tremor at first, but it grew until he balled them into fists on the table, as if to still them by force. He could not meet her gaze. His eyes dropped to his own scarred hands, and he stared at them as if he were disgusted by them, by himself, by the entire sordid transaction that had brought this proud, desperate woman to his bleak table. He understood the profound, crushing weight of her question. In that moment, Aoife was seized by a mix of emotions, the cold terror of her situation, a hot spike of defiance, and a desperate, primal need to take control of the one thing she had left in the world, her own body. If this was a bargain, then she would be the one to dictate the terms of payment. She would not be taken like a timid animal. She would meet the ugliness of this moment head-on. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed her chair back and stood up. Her hands were steady as she raised them to the high collar of her worn, gray dress. Her eyes never left his, though he was still staring at his fists. She began to unbutton the collar, her fingers moving with a grim, unhurried grace. This was not an act of seduction, of coy invitation. It was an act of grim acceptance and a stark challenge. "I understand the bargain. I am not afraid. I will not shy away from what is due. This is what you paid for. Look at me." As the second button came free, he flinched as if she had struck him. His head snapped up, and his gray eyes were wide with an emotion she could not decipher. It was horror, and something else, something deeper. "No," he rasped, his voice thick and choked. He stood so abruptly that his chair screeched back and toppled over with a loud crash. He turned his back to her, stumbling a step toward the cold stone hearth, presenting her with nothing but the rigid, tense line of his shoulders. That's not what he started, his voice cracking. He stopped, unable to finish. He stared into the empty fireplace as if the answers were written in the soot. "You will sleep in the bed," he finally said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'll take the cot." He did not turn around. He could not bear to look at her, to see her vulnerability, her defiance, and his own ugly part in creating this moment. The tension in the small room was electric, a palpable force that crackled in the silence. Aoife stopped, her fingers frozen on the third button of her dress. She was left standing in the middle of the room, half undressed, a maelstrom of confusion, relief, and a strange, unfamiliar pang of compassion for this broken man. He had not shown her cruelty or lust. He had shown her a deep, hidden well of honor and a shame so profound it was a physical pain. The night ended in that silence. She rebuttoned her dress, her hands now trembling slightly. He righted his chair but did not sit, after a long, stretched moment. She walked to the bed in the corner and lay down, fully clothed, pulling the thin quilt over her. He remained by the fire for a time before moving to the cot in the opposite corner. The darkness of the small cabin became a vast, empty space between them. They were utterly alone, yet inextricably, terrifyingly bound together, each staring into the void, listening to the sound of the other's breathing. The first weeks passed in a state of silent, arduous adjustment. Life on the ranch was stripped down to the bare necessities of survival, a relentless cycle of labor that began before the sun and ended long after it had set. Aoife woke each morning to the biting cold that seeped through the log walls and the steady, rhythmic thump of Elias's limp on the wooden floorboards. He was always up first, a shadow moving in the pre-dawn gloom, stoking the fire before heading out into the darkness. They established a routine without the need for words, a silent choreography of shared existence. He was the master of the world outside the cabin door. His days were spent with the livestock, mending the miles of fences that seemed to constantly sag or snap, and wresting a living from the unforgiving land. She became the mistress of the small, Spartan cabin. Her domain was the hearth, the rough-hewn table, the mending basket. She cooked, she cleaned, she washed their few clothes by hand in a tub of icy water. The sheer physical effort required just to exist was a shock to her system. In Boston, the work had been grueling, but it was the work of machines. Here, the work was of the body. Hauling water from the deep well was a battle with a stiff hand pump that left her hands raw and blistered, her back a column of fire. The food was monotonous, jerky, beans, hardtack, and she felt a constant, low-level hunger that was a pale ghost of the starvation she had known in Ireland. The wind was a relentless, howling presence. It was never quiet. It moaned around the corners of the cabin, rattled the window panes, and seemed to find every tiny crack in the chinking to send a knife-like draft of cold air scything through the room. Some days, she felt a profound loneliness, a homesickness so sharp it was a physical ache in her chest. She would stare out at the endless brown prairie and her heart would cry out for the gentle, impossible green of the Irish hills, for the soft rain and the familiar comfort of her own language. In those moments, the cabin felt like a prison, and the silent, scarred man who shared it with her was her warden. From a distance, Elias Thorne watched her. He had expected a fragile city girl, someone who would complain or cry or, worse, simply break under the strain of this life. He had been prepared for that. He was not prepared for Aoife Callahan. He observed her quiet competence, the way she learned the rhythms of the homestead without a single word of instruction. He saw her attack the woodpile with a grim determination, her jaw set, her small frame straining as she swung the heavy axe. The first few swings were awkward, clumsy, but she did not give up. She kept at it until she could split a log with a satisfying crack. He watched her by candlelight, her head bent over one of his torn work shirts, her fingers moving with a quick, meticulous grace as she laid down a line of stitches so small and neat they were nearly invisible. He had never in his life owned a shirt so perfectly mended. One morning, as he was checking the corral, he heard a sound that made him pause. It was her voice, soft and lilting, talking to the half-dozen scrawny chickens she had claimed as her own. She was not speaking English, but the melodic, flowing language of her homeland. He did not understand the words, but the tone was one of gentle affection. It was a sound of life, of tenderness, in the harsh, silent world he had built for himself. These small observations, collected over days and weeks, began to methodically chip away at the crude image he held of her as a mere transaction. He started to see the woman herself, a person of immense, quiet strength and hidden, unfathomable depths. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, small gestures of consideration began to pass between them, like fragile seedlings pushing up through hard-packed earth. One morning, the wind was particularly vicious, carrying the first real bite of winter. Aoife spent the better part of an hour at the well, her shawl wrapped tight around her head, battling the frozen handle of the pump for a single bucket of water. When she finally stumbled back inside, her face numb and her fingers aching with cold, she found a full bucket of fresh water waiting for her just inside the door. She knew, without question, that he had brought it in for her before he left for the day. She said nothing when he returned that evening, and neither did he, but a quiet, surprising warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Another day, exploring a dusty shelf in the corner, she found a worn book on local flora. She spent hours poring over the sketches, painstakingly identifying a few of the wild, hardy herbs that grew in the shelter of the creek bed. That evening, she prepared a stew, enriching the thin broth with the herbs and a handful of wild onions she had dug up. When Elias came in for dinner, he ate in his usual silence, his gaze fixed on his plate. But when he was finished, he pushed the empty plate away, looked at her directly for the first time in days, and said, "That was good." The two words landed in the quiet landscape of their existence with the force of a seismic event. All she could do was nod, a quick, jerky motion, before turning away to busy herself at the hearth. But her heart gave a strange, unexpected flutter. They were learning a new language, one spoken not with words, but with buckets of water and savory stews, with mended shirts and split logs. It was a language of action, of mutual survival. A month after her arrival, the need for supplies forced them to make the trip to the nearby town of Redemption. The journey in the rattling wagon was as silent as her first one had been. But it was a different kind of silence now, less fraught with tension, more a shared habit. Redemption was a dusty, wind-blown collection of unpainted wooden storefronts, a stark white church, and a saloon whose swinging doors seemed to be in constant motion. As they guided the wagon down the main street, Aoife felt the weight of dozens of eyes on them. The townspeople stared openly, their curiosity unmasked. The stares were a harsh awakening to their shared status as outcasts. The women who gathered outside the mercantile paused in their conversations to whisper behind their hands, their gazes filled with a potent mixture of pity and contempt. Aoife could almost hear the words, the bought bride, the poor creature, married to him. The men who loitered on the boardwalks looked at Elias with a wary suspicion, their eyes lingering on his scarred face as if it were an omen of violence or bad luck. And when they looked at her, it was with a leering, possessive curiosity that made her skin crawl, as if her presence here was an open invitation for their speculation. The prejudice was palpable, a suffocating blanket of hostility that made her want to shrink into herself. The primary source of that hostility was made clear in the general store. He was a man who seemed to take up all the air in the room the moment he entered. He was tall and imposing, handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, and dressed in a fine coat and polished boots that spoke of a prosperity far beyond anyone else in the dusty town. His name, she would soon learn, was Silas Croft. He was everything Elias was not, polished, confident, and radiating an aura of open contempt for the world around him. Croft, who had been speaking with the store owner, made a point of approaching them as they stood by the counter. He took off his hat with a flourish and gave Aoife a slow, predatory smile, his eyes lingering on her face and figure in a way that was deeply insulting. Then he turned to Elias, his smile thinning, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "Thorn," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Did not think you would ever find a woman desperate enough to share that hovel of yours. Must have cost you a pretty penny." The casual cruelty of the words struck the air like a whip. Elias's body went rigid, his good hand resting on the counter, balled into a tight fist, his knuckles white. Aoife saw a raw, murderous fury flash in his gray eyes, mixed with a deep, scalding humiliation. He was a proud man being stripped bare in public. Before he could say or do anything he would regret. Something inside Aoife snapped. The same defiant fire that had propelled her out of Ireland, out of the Boston mill, surged through her. She took a small step forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Elias. She looked Silas Croft directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and cold as ice. "My husband is a man of honor," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with perfect clarity through the suddenly silent store. "I cannot say the same for everyone in this town." A shocked, breathless silence fell over the room. The store owner froze with his hand in a barrel of pickles. The women who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence. Silas Croft's practiced smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, murderous fury. He had been publicly challenged and rebuffed by the pitiful mail-order bride, and his monumental pride was deeply wounded. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes promising retribution, before turning on his heel and stalking out of the store. The confrontation had drawn a line in the sand. It had established Croft as a direct and dangerous threat, but it had also, in that single, charged moment, solidified Elias and Aoife as allies against a hostile world. The ride back to the ranch was thick with tension. Elias was a coiled spring of repressed anger, his hands gripping the reins so tightly they shook. Aoife sat beside him, her own body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. But she also felt a strange, fierce sense of empowerment. She had defended him. She had defended them. When the lonely shape of their cabin was visible in the distance, Elias finally broke the silence. "You should not have done that," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. "You have made an enemy of him." Aoife looked at his stern profile, at the hard line of his jaw. "It seems to me," she replied quietly, "that he was already your enemy, which makes him mine, too." Elias turned his head and looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a purchase or a responsibility, but as the woman sitting beside him. In her tired but defiant face, he saw a fierceness and a loyalty he had never known. In that moment, the formidable wall he had built around himself cracked. He saw her not as a burden he had taken on, but as a partner who had willingly stepped up to stand with him. He gave a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement. It was an unspoken pact, a treaty signed in the face of a common enemy. That evening, a subtle but profound shift occurred in the cabin. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, shared understanding. After their meal, Aoife found Elias staring into the fire, his expression troubled, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. She hesitated for a moment, then took the other chair, not too close, but not as far away as she normally would. "They look at you like you are a monster," she said softly, speaking of the people in town. He did not look away from the flames. "To them, I am," he said, his voice flat. He was silent for a long time, and she thought that was all he would say. But then, for the first time, he volunteered a piece of his own story. "My father was a hard man. a cruel man. He owned a fine ranch once, twice the size of Croft's, but he had a thirst for whiskey and a weakness for cards. He paused, the firelight flickering across his scars. He lost it all, drank and gambled away every last acre, every last head of cattle, left me with nothing but this hard-scrabble piece of land and a family name that is synonymous with disgrace in that town. They have long memories in redemption. It was a small confession, a brief, unadorned summary of a lifetime of disappointment, but to Aoife, it felt like a profound offering of trust. He was showing her the wounds beneath his scars. Later that night, long after the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Aoife was woken by a noise. It was the sound of the cabin door creaking open and shut. She sat up in bed, her heart quickening. Elias was not in his cot. A sliver of moon cast a pale light through the window, and she could see his cot was empty, slipping out from under the quilt. She padded silently to the door and peered out. She found him standing by the corral, his back to her, a rigid silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He was completely still, but she could sense a terrible tension radiating from him. His breathing was ragged, harsh gasps of air that were almost sobs. As she drew closer, she could hear him muttering, fragmented phrases torn from a place of deep trauma. Hold the line, I'm coming." It was the war. He was not here, under the vast, peaceful Wyoming sky. He was back there, in the blood and smoke and terror of a battlefield she could not imagine. He was in the throes of a nightmare, wide awake and trapped within it. She hesitated, a cold fear gripping her. This was a private agony, a part of him she had no right to see. But the sound of his ragged breathing, the sheer lonely anguish of his posture, overrode her fear. She walked up to him, her bare feet silent in the soft dust, and gently placed a hand on his arm. He flinched as if he had been shot. He spun around with a terrifying, inhuman speed, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. His arm was raised, his hand curled into a fist, poised to strike. For one horrifying second, he did not see her. His clear gray eyes were crazed, looking straight through her, seeing an enemy soldier in the dark, a threat to be eliminated. Her breath caught in her throat. Then his eyes focused. The wildness, the madness, drained away in an instant, replaced by a wave of utter horror and shame as he realized who she was, where he was, and what he had almost done. "Aoife," he breathed, his voice breaking on her name. He stumbled back, away from her, as if her touch had burned him. "I am sorry. I did not—" He could not finish. He looked at her, his face a mask of raw, unguarded agony, the terror of his own past laid bare for her to see. He looked utterly broken. Instead of retreating, instead of running from this frightening, wounded man, she took a step closer to him. "Elias," she said, her voice soft but perfectly steady, a small, solid anchor in the terrifying sea of his memory. "You are here. You are safe." She did not touch him again. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply stood with him under the vast, silent, star-filled sky, a quiet witness to his pain. She waited, her presence a steady, unwavering thing, until the violent shaking in his shoulders finally began to subside, and his ragged breathing slowly evened out. It was a moment of profound, non-physical intimacy, a silent acknowledgement of the deep, invisible wounds they both carried. In the cold, clear darkness, two broken souls stood together, and for the first time, neither of them felt entirely alone. The night of the shared nightmare became a silent turning point. The fragile truce that had existed between them, born of necessity and mutual isolation, began the slow, cautious process of solidifying into a tentative friendship. The invisible wall that Elias had so carefully constructed around himself had been breached, not by force, but by a quiet act of witness. In the days that followed, the silence in the cabin changed its nature. It was no longer a void of unspoken tension, but a comfortable, shared space where words were not always necessary. The days fell into a rhythm of shared labor that felt less like a division of tasks and more like a partnership. Aoife, driven by a restless curiosity and a deep-seated need to be useful, began to take an active interest in the ranch itself. She started asking Elias questions, at first simple and hesitant, then more complex and confident. She asked about the strange, hardy cattle, about the cycles of the seasons in this alien land, about the subtle signs of changing weather that he seemed to read in the wind and sky. He was initially hesitant to share his knowledge, guarding it as he guarded everything else. It was his world, his language, and for years, his solitary prison. But her curiosity was so genuine, her understanding so quick, that his reticence began to melt away. He found himself showing her how a certain formation of clouds gathering over the western peaks meant snow was coming, even on a clear day. He pointed out the faint tracks of a stray calf and explained how to read its path, its speed, its fear. He walked with her along the creek bed, crushing the leaves of different plants between his rough fingers, teaching her which were safe for livestock and which were poison, which could be used to soothe a cough and which could ease a fever. He found an unexpected, almost painful pleasure in teaching her, in sharing the grim knowledge that had been his only companion for so long. Through her eyes, the land he had seen only as a place of hardship and brutal survival began to reveal hints of a deeper, more complex beauty. She, in turn, began to bring a sense of life to the stark, empty cabin. In a small patch of soil by the door, protected from the worst of the wind, she planted a small herb garden. She had carefully collected the seeds and cuttings from the plants he had shown her, and soon the sharp, clean scent of mint and the warm, earthy smell of wild thyme began to permeate the air, a small but defiant bastion of life against the vast, dusty expanse, and she began to sing. As she kneaded dough or mended a saddle blanket, she would sing softly to herself, the melodies rising and falling in the quiet room. They were old Irish ballads, songs of tragic love and profound loss, of a green land across a wide, unforgiving sea. The sound of her voice, filled with a sweet, aching melancholy, filled the empty spaces of their home and of his heart. Their conversations deepened, slowly moving from the practical matters of the ranch to the more personal territories of their own lives. One evening, as she sat by the fire mending a thick horse blanket, her needle flashing in the firelight, she asked him about a book she had seen him take down from a high shelf on a rare, quiet afternoon. It was a thin volume with a cover of cracked and faded leather. "It was Shakespeare," she said. "The sonnets, I think." A dull flush rose on his neck and crept up past his collar to the edge of his scars. He looked deeply embarrassed, as if she had discovered a secret weakness. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering, his voice low. "My mother," he said. "She taught me to read from that book. She gave it to me before she passed away. I was just a boy." He did not elaborate, but the words hung in the air, a small, precious offering. After another long silence, he cleared his throat and recited a few lines from memory, his rough voice surprisingly gentle, the elegant, centuries-old words, a strange and beautiful thing in the rustic cabin. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." When he finished, a quiet settled between them, heavy with unspoken things. In return, Aoife put down her mending and went to her small bundle. She took out her own worn, leather-bound book. "This was my mother's, and her mother's before," she said, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. She opened it to a page marked with a dried wildflower and began to read. It was a poem about the sea, about its beauty and its cruelty, about the way its vastness could connect people or separate them forever. Her voice was filled with a powerful, aching nostalgia, the Gaelic words a river of sound that flowed through the silent room. In these moments, they were no longer just the scarred rancher and the desperate immigrant. They saw beyond those harsh, simple labels to the people they had been before tragedy had remade them. She saw a sensitive, educated man who loved poetry and mourned his mother. He saw a cultured, gentle woman who carried the soul of her lost home within her. They were sharing the fragile, broken pieces of their former selves, and in doing so, they were beginning to create something new, something whole, together. The outside world intruded upon their fragile peace with the sudden, violent arrival of an early blizzard. It swept down from the mountains with a terrifying, unnatural speed. One afternoon the sky was a clear, crisp blue. The next morning it was a uniform, leaden gray, the color of dirty iron. The wind, their constant companion, lost its monotonous moan and began to shriek like a banshee, tearing at the cabin with furious, invisible claws. "It is coming," Elias said, his face grim as he stared out the window. "And it is coming fast." The day became a frantic race against the storm. Elias worked with a desperate, focused energy, his limp more pronounced as he hurried to secure the livestock in the relative safety of the barn, reinforcing the doors against the coming gale. Aoife worked inside, preparing their small fortress. She stuffed rags and dried moss into every crack in the log walls she could find. She hauled in armload after armload of firewood, stacking it high against the hearth until her back screamed in protest. The air grew colder, the light outside dimmer, and a strange, expectant silence fell, the world holding its breath. Then the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a peaceful winter day, but thick, heavy, and fast, driven almost horizontally by the howling wind. Within an hour, the world outside the small windows was gone, erased by a raging, blinding vortex of white. The sound of the wind rose to a deafening roar, a constant, high-pitched scream that seemed to press in on them from all sides. They were trapped. The ranch was no longer a point in a vast landscape. It was a tiny, fragile island in a furious white ocean, completely isolated from the rest of the world. They were sealed together in the small, warm space of the cabin. The enforced proximity of the blizzard acted as a crucible for their burgeoning relationship. For days, they were never more than a few feet apart. The normal buffers of work and the vast outdoor spaces were gone. The cabin, which had often felt like a cage, now became their entire world. A strange calm descended within its four walls, a stark contrast to the elemental fury raging just outside. The storm stripped away all pretense, all routine, leaving only the two of them and the long hours to fill. And so they talked. They talked for hours, their voices a low murmur against the constant scream of the wind. They shared stories they had never told another living soul. He spoke of his boyhood, of the brief, happy years before his mother's death and before his father's descent into bitterness and drink. She spoke of Ireland, painting vivid pictures of the festivals and the music, of the faces of the family she had lost. They were not just sharing memories, they were entrusting each other with their ghosts. On the third night of the blizzard, the storm reached the peak of its fury. They sat huddled by the fire, its warmth the only thing holding the ferocious cold at bay. The conversation had lulled, and they were staring into the dancing flames, lost in their own thoughts. In the flickering firelight, the scars on Elias's face seemed to deepen, to twist with a life of their own. Aoife looked at him, at the profound, settled sadness in his eyes, and she sensed that he was ready to speak of the thing that had marked him so deeply, inside and out. "Elias," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. "The war, your scars. Will you tell me?" He remained silent for a long time, so long that she thought he had not heard her, or had chosen to ignore her. He continued to stare into the flames, his jaw tight. Then, he finally drew a long, ragged breath and began to speak, his voice low and heavy with the weight of a decade of memory. "It was at Gettysburg," he said. "After the third day, the main fighting was over." He shook his head, a small, bitter motion. "I was not injured in some heroic charge. It was not a wound I earned saving the flag or taking a cannon." His voice was laced with a self-loathing that was painful to hear. "The fighting was done. The field was covered with the wounded, thousands of them, crying out. The sound, I will never forget that sound." He paused, gathering himself. "My closest friend, a young boy from my hometown named Sam. We grew up together. We were tasked with retrieving the wounded, carrying them back to the surgeon's tents. It was night. We were carrying a man on a stretcher when a stray piece of shrapnel from a misfired Confederate cannon. They were firing at nothing, just clearing their guns. It exploded in the trees above us. His voice dropped, becoming thick and choked. It killed Sam instantly. He never made a sound. It tore my face and my leg apart. I fell. I lay on that field for hours, next to my dead friend, listening to the other men cry for their mothers, for water, for death, before they found me. He finally looked at her, his clear gray eyes swimming with unshed tears. "These scars," he said, his voice breaking as he gestured to his face, "they are not a mark of bravery. They are a constant reminder that I was right there, and I could do nothing, that I failed to save him, that I lived, and he died." As he finished his story, the tears he had held back for 10 years finally fell, streaming down his face, cutting clean tracks through the dust and grime of the day. He did not try to hide them. He did not turn away. It was a moment of complete, devastating vulnerability, a soul laid bare in the firelight. Aoife listened without interrupting, her heart aching with a compassion so intense it felt like her own pain. When his voice trailed off into a choked silence, she did not offer empty platitudes or easy words of comfort. There were no words for such a wound. Instead, moved by an instinct she did not fully understand, she reached out her hand, gently, tentatively, her fingers trembling slightly. She traced the line of the main scar on his cheek. It was the first time she had ever willingly touched him with tenderness. He flinched at the initial contact, his body recoiling as if from a blow, but then, as her touch lingered, soft and accepting, something in him seemed to break. He leaned into her hand, his eyes closing, a shudder running through his large frame. The simple warmth of her skin against his scarred flesh was a revelation, a balm on a wound he thought could never be soothed. In that moment of profound connection, she felt compelled to share her own deepest tragedy, to meet his vulnerability with her own. "I had a sister," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Her name was Mayreed. She was 6 years old." She told him in detail about the famine, about the slow, cruel progression of starvation. She described watching her bright, laughing younger sister waste away, her limbs becoming like twigs, her eyes growing huge in her tiny, gaunt face. She spoke of the helplessness, the impotent rage, the profound, unending guilt of being the older one, the stronger one, the one who survived. "I held her in my arms as she died," Aoife finished, her own tears now falling freely. She was so light it was like holding a little bird. Their shared confessions of guilt and loss, of being the ones left behind, forged an unbreakable bond of empathy between them. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a contract. They were two survivors who understood the specific, intimate shape of each other's pain. The air in the cabin was charged with a new, powerful emotion. The simmering physical desire that had been ruthlessly suppressed by both of them now surfaced, no longer a crude necessity of their arrangement, but something pure and profound, hopelessly intertwined with this deep emotional connection. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and for the first time, he was not just seeing the woman who ran his house, he was truly seeing her, seeing the impossible strength in her tear-filled eyes, the beauty of her resilient soul. And she looked at him, at his ravaged face, and saw not the scars, but the honorable, wounded, beautiful man beneath. He slowly leaned in, his movement hesitant, asking a question. She met him halfway, giving her answer. Their first kiss was not frantic or desperate. It was slow, deep, and filled with a decade of unspoken longing for comfort, for connection, for acceptance. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, of salt from their shared tears, and of a tentative, burgeoning hope. They broke apart, their foreheads resting against each other, their breathing ragged and unsteady. The storm still howled outside the log walls, a raging, chaotic beast. But for the first time since they had met, neither of them felt alone. They did not take it further that night. The kiss was too sacred, the emotional ground they stood upon too new and fragile, with a silent, shared understanding. They retreated to their separate beds, but the space between them was no longer an empty chasm. It was filled with the warmth of a silent promise and the profound, terrifying, and beautiful possibility of love. The blizzard broke on the 5th day, its fury spent. It retreated back into the northern mountains, leaving behind a world transformed, silent, and profound. When Aoife opened the cabin door that morning, the light that greeted her was so brilliant it was almost blinding. The landscape, once a monotonous canvas of brown and ochre, was now covered in a pristine, impossibly deep blanket of white snow. Every rock, every twisted branch of sagebrush, was softened and purified, buried under a mantle of absolute white. The air was so crisp and clean it felt like a physical tonic in her lungs, scoured of all dust and impurity. The sunrise that followed was a spectacle of breathtaking beauty, a slow, majestic bleed of pale pink and brilliant gold across the eastern sky, reflecting off the endless snowfields until the entire world seemed to be made of light. For Elias and Aoife, it felt like a new beginning, a world washed clean of the past. The storm had not only isolated them physically, it had burned away the last vestiges of their former arrangement. The dynamic in the cabin had irrevocably shifted. The heavy silence and careful shyness were gone, replaced by a comfortable, easy intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. They shared smiles over steaming mugs of coffee in the morning, their eyes meeting over the rims of their cups in a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the firelight during the storm. Casual touches, once unthinkable, became commonplace, her hand brushing his arm as she reached for the salt, his fingers grazing hers as he passed her a log for the fire. These small, fleeting moments were electric, charged with a significance that belied their simplicity. Their evenings were filled with long conversations that meandered from the profound to the mundane, their shared laughter a warm, new sound within the log walls. They were falling in love, slowly, cautiously, but with an undeniable certainty, like a river finding its inevitable path to the sea. With the slow, steady arrival of spring, the ranch itself seemed to wake from a long slumber, mirroring the blossoming of their relationship. The great thaw began. The immense blanket of snow receded day by day, melting into the thirsty earth and revealing the first tender, green shoots of new grass. The creek, which had been a frozen, silent serpent of ice, began to run again, its gurgling song a welcome return of life. In the corral, the first calves were born, spindly-legged and vulnerable. Aoife discovered a deep, surprising well of maternal tenderness in caring for them, her voice soft and cooing as she helped a weak calf find its mother's teat. The fierce, protective instinct she felt for these small creatures was a powerful and unfamiliar emotion. She and Elias now worked as a true team. The division of labor was no longer a rigid line drawn at the cabin door. He taught her how to mend a section of fence, his large, scarred hands patiently guiding hers as she learned to stretch the wire taut and secure it. She, in turn, began to take an interest in the ranch's meager finances, her quick mind for figures bringing a semblance of order to his haphazard ledger. One afternoon, he decided it was time she learned to ride properly. He led out a gentle, older mare named Daisy, a horse with patient eyes and a calm demeanor. He showed her how to place the blanket and the saddle, his explanations clear and concise. When it came time for her to mount, he placed his hands on her waist to help her up. His touch was firm and respectful, but it sent a jolt of heat through her that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. For a moment, she was acutely aware of his strength, of their proximity, of the scent of leather and clean sweat that clung to him. He held her steady as she found her balance in the saddle, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. He taught her how to hold the reins, how to guide the horse with gentle shifts in her weight, his voice a low, steady presence beside her. She proved to be a natural, her movements fluid and confident. Soon, they were riding out together to check the fences and the herd, moving across the vast greening landscape as true partners. The shared work no longer felt like a chore, but like a quiet celebration of their shared purpose. Her laughter, once a sound as rare as rain in a drought, now became a frequent and welcome melody on the ranch. It echoed across the prairie when one of the calves kicked up its heels in a joyful dance, or when Elias told a dry, understated joke. It was a sound that worked its way into his soul, a sound he quickly realized he could not live without. The romantic and physical aspects of their relationship, which had been held in a state of suspended animation since their first kiss during the blizzard, now began to deepen with an inexorable, natural gravity. The unspoken desire that simmered between them grew with each shared glance, each casual touch. One warm evening in late spring, after a long, dusty day of branding calves, they went down to the creek to wash. The setting sun cast a long, golden glow over the landscape, turning the surface of the water into a sheet of molten gold. They stripped down to their underclothes and waded into the cool, clear water, the work of the day sluicing away from them. The moment was charged with an unspoken, powerful current that had nothing to do with the gentle flow of the creek. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. When they met in the middle of the stream, Elias reached for her, his wet hands finding her waist and pulling her close against him. Their kiss was hungry and passionate, a celebration of the vibrant, pulsing life they had found together in this desolate place. It was a kiss that tasted of clean water, warm sun, and a deep, soul-shaking relief. That night, for the first time, he did not go to his cot. After the fire had burned low, he came to her bed, a tall shadow in the moonlight streaming through the window. She welcomed him, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a profound and joyful anticipation. Their lovemaking was a culmination of everything they had been through together. It was tender in its exploration, fierce in its passion, and deeply, profoundly healing. It was a physical sealing of the emotional bond that had been forged in shared pain and quiet survival. As they lay tangled together in the aftermath, listening to the sound of each other's breathing, Aoife looked around the small, moonlit room. For the first time, the cabin did not feel like a shelter or a cage. It felt like a home. It felt like a sanctuary, filled with a warmth and a love she had never thought to know. Their newfound happiness, however, was a fragile thing in a world that did not wish them well. On another necessary trip to redemption for supplies, the change in them was obvious to anyone who cared to look. They walked down the main street together, not with the wide, wary distance of strangers, but side by side. Elias's limp seemed less pronounced, his shoulders less hunched. He carried himself with a new, quiet dignity. Aoife's head was held high. Her face, though still thin, was filled with a serene confidence that had replaced the haunted look in her eyes. They largely ignored the whispers and the stares of the townspeople, wrapped in the private, resilient world they had built for themselves. But Silas Croft saw them. He was standing on the boardwalk outside the saloon, and his eyes narrowed at the sight of them. He saw the easy way Elias placed a hand on the small of Aoife's back to guide her into the mercantile. He saw the genuine smile she gave him in return. The sight of their simple, unadorned happiness fueled his resentment and greed into a toxic, burning rage. He had long coveted the Thorn Ranch, not for its meager herd, but for its steady, year-round access to Coyote Creek, a crucial water source in this dry country. He had always seen the failing homestead as something that would eventually fall into his hands. Now, he saw a thriving enterprise, brought back from the brink by the determination of the woman at Thorn's side. And he saw Aoife, not as the pitiful, bought bride he had mocked, but as a strong, proud, and desirable woman who had looked at him, Silas Croft, the most powerful man in the county, and had chosen the scarred, broken outcast over him. His wounded pride and his avarice curdled into a dangerous, unshakable resolve. He would not just take the ranch. He would destroy what they had built. He would crush the happiness that he felt they had stolen from him. Croft's campaign of harassment began subtly, with the cowardly malice of a snake in the grass. One morning, Elias rode out to find a long section of his northern fence had been cut. The wires snipped clean through. A dozen head of their best cattle had wandered off into the open range. It took Elias and Aoife 2 exhausting days under a hot sun to track them down and round them up. A few weeks later, they woke to a foul, gagging stench coming from their well. Elias lowered a lantern and found the bloated carcass of a coyote rotting in their water supply. It was a sickening, deliberate act of vandalism that took him the better part of a day to haul the carcass out, and several more days of bucketing the well dry until the water ran clean again. Elias knew, with a cold certainty in the pit of his stomach, that it was Croft. But there was no proof. When he rode into town to speak to the local sheriff, a lazy, pot-bellied man named Gable who was firmly in Croft's pocket, his complaints were dismissed with a wave of the hand. The cut fence was blamed on rustlers. The fouled well was just a tragic accident. Bad luck. There was nothing to be done. The incidents, while not devastating in themselves, created a constant low-level sense of unease, a feeling of being under siege. The constant threat hung over their happiness like a dark, gathering cloud. The social pressure from the town also began to intensify, fueled by a steady stream of rumors and innuendos spread by Croft and his cronies. The narrative he spun in the saloon and the mercantile was a clever and poisonous one. The strange, reclusive Thorne was not in his right mind, they whispered. He was being manipulated by his clever, foreign wife, who had some strange hold over him. They were hoarders, unfriendly, a blight on the community. The poison seeped into the town's consciousness. They were denied credit at the general store, the owner suddenly claiming he could no longer carry their account. The blacksmith, who had once been fair, began to overcharge Elias for his work, knowing he had nowhere else to go. The few people in town who had once been neutrally polite now turned their backs when they saw them coming. They were completely and utterly ostracized, their small ranch an isolated island in a wide sea of hostility. The final, cruelest blow came not from Croft, but from the institution that was meant to offer solace. One evening, Elias returned from a long ride searching for a stray calf to find the cabin door ajar and an unfamiliar horse tied to the hitching post. He entered to find Aoife sitting at the table, her back rigid, her hands clenched in her lap. Standing over her was the town preacher, a tall, severe man named Reverend Miller. The preacher, who had not seen Elias enter, was in the middle of a self-righteous lecture. "And I must therefore inform you as a representative of this God-fearing community that your unnatural union is an offense to the Lord," the preacher intoned, his voice dripping with sanctimonious piety. "You are living in sin with a man clearly marked by darkness, a man who shuns the fellowship of the church. You and your husband are no longer welcome in the house of the Lord." Elias stepped forward. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut the preacher off mid-sentence. Reverend Miller spun around, startled. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain his authority. "I am only doing my Christian duty, Mr. Thorne." "Your duty is not in this house," Elias said, taking another step. "Leave, now." There was a cold, deadly promise in his eyes that made the preacher take a hasty step back. Without another word, the Reverend Miller scurried out the door, mounted his horse, and fled. Elias turned to Aoife. She had not moved. She sat staring at the tabletop, her face pale and still. But as he watched, a single tear traced a path down her cheek, then another, and another. Her resilient exterior, which had withstood starvation, exploitation, and fear, had finally been broken by the preacher's casual, self-righteous cruelty. His words had touched upon her deepest, most secret fears of being an unworthy, tainted outsider, a sinner, a woman who did not belong. A great shuddering sob escaped her, and she buried her face in her hands. Elias was overcome with a cold, protective fury that was more intense than any emotion he had ever felt. He went to her, kneeling by her chair, and gathered her into his arms. He held her as she wept, her body shaking with grief and humiliation, his hands stroking her hair, his own heart aching with a love so fierce it felt like it could burn down the world. He let her cry until the first storm of her grief had passed. Then he gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. He looked at her tear-streaked face, at the raw pain in her eyes, and the vow he made in that moment was the most sacred of his life. "Let them talk," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, a promise of retribution. "Let them condemn us. I have been in hell. Aoife, I know what it looks like." "And this," he said, his gaze sweeping around the simple, beloved cabin, at her, at the life they had painstakingly built from the ashes of their pasts. "This is not it. This is the only heaven I have ever known." He held her gaze, his own eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering conviction. "As long as I have you, they can all be damned." His words were more than a comfort. They were a powerful vow, a declaration of allegiance. He was no longer just her husband or her partner. He was her sworn protector, her shield against the world. They were no longer just surviving together. They were now actively, defiantly fighting for their love against a world that wanted to tear them apart. The threat from outside, designed to break them, had only served to forge the bond between them into something stronger, more defiant, and infinitely more precious than either of them could have imagined. Elias's vow, spoken into the quiet grief of the cabin, became the bedrock of their summer. The hostility from the town and the ever-present threat of Silas Croft, rather than driving a wedge between them, served only to insulate them further, strengthening the walls of the fragile, beautiful world they had built for themselves. They turned their backs on redemption and poured all their energy, all their hope, and all their burgeoning love into the ranch. The summer was a season of intense, unrelenting work. They rose with the sun, their days a long litany of shared labor under the vast, hot sky. Their herd, small but hardy, grew healthy and strong on the plentiful summer grass. Together, they rode the long fence lines, mending the wire, replacing posts, their hands often working in tandem, their movements a silent, practiced choreography. They put all their effort into the hayfield, a stretch of bottomland near the creek. Elias swung the scythe with a steady, powerful rhythm, his scarred face beaded with sweat, while Aoife followed behind, raking the sweet-smelling grass into neat rows to dry. They worked until their muscles screamed and their backs ached, but it was a good, clean ache, the ache of building something, of providing for their own future. Their love was the fuel that drove them. It was in the cool cup of water she brought him in the field without his having to ask. It was in the way he took the heaviest tasks upon himself, trying to shield her from the most grueling aspects of the work. It was in the shared, weary smiles at the end of the day, a silent acknowledgement of their partnership. They worked from sunup to sundown, but their evenings were filled with a quiet, profound joy that neither had ever known. In the soft glow of the kerosene lamp, they would read to each other, his Shakespeare, her Irish poetry, their voices filling the small cabin with worlds beyond their own. They talked endlessly about the future, their dreams no longer the solitary, desperate hopes of individuals, but the shared, tangible plans of a family. They spoke of buying the small parcel of land to the west, of damming the creek to irrigate a larger garden, of having children. The idea of a child, their child, was a terrifying and beautiful possibility, a small seed of hope planted in the harsh soil of their reality. They had built a sanctuary for themselves in the face of all the ugliness, a life of purpose and love. And in the quiet moments, lying together in the darkness, they allowed themselves to believe that their hard work and their fierce, abiding love would be enough to see them through. But their success was a beacon in the dark for a man whose heart was filled with envy. Silas Croft watched from a distance, and what he saw turned his greed and resentment into a festering, obsessive hatred. His initial attempts at petty sabotage, the cut fences, the fouled well, had failed to break them. In fact, he could see with his own eyes that the adversity had only made them stronger, more united. He saw the Thorn Ranch, which he had for so long regarded as a decrepit holding ripe for the taking, beginning to thrive. He saw their herd fattening on the good grass. He saw the hay being cut and stored, a clear sign of their intention to stay, to endure. Their success was a personal affront, a daily mockery of his power. His wounded pride festered, and his avarice grew more desperate. He could not simply drive them off the land anymore. He had to utterly ruin them. He had to leave them with nothing but ash and despair, a scorched testament to the folly of defying him. The dark tragedy struck on a dry, windy night in late autumn. The air was restless, the wind moaning through the eaves of the cabin, carrying the first real chill of the coming winter. Elias and Aoife had spent the day making the final preparations, reinforcing the barn against the heavy snows they knew were on their way. They fell into bed exhausted, their bodies heavy with a deep, satisfying weariness, and sleep took them quickly. It was Aoife who woke first. She was pulled from a deep dream by a strange, flickering orange glow dancing against the log wall of the cabin. For a moment, she was disoriented, thinking it was a trick of the moonlight. Then she heard it, a frantic, terrified lowing from the cattle in the corral, a sound of pure panic. At the same moment, the acrid smell of smoke reached her, sharp and terrifying. She shook Elias awake with a frantic urgency. "Elias, wake up, the barn!" He came awake instantly, his senses on high alert. They both scrambled from the bed and rushed to the small window. The sight that greeted them was apocalyptic. The barn, the structure that held their horses, their winter supply of hay, the very fruit of their entire year's labor, was completely engulfed in flames. The fire was a monstrous, roaring beast, its orange and yellow tongues licking at the black, star-filled sky, sending a shower of embers swirling into the wind. Without a second thought, Elias was pulling on his boots. He grabbed the empty water bucket from by the door. His face was a grim mask of disbelief and fury, his only thought for the living creatures trapped inside the inferno. "The horses!" he yelled back at Aoife over the deafening roar of the fire. "I have to get the horses!" He ran out the door and toward the raging inferno. Aoife screamed his name, a raw, terrified sound that was swallowed by the fire's roar. "No, Elias, it is too dangerous. Come back." But he did not listen, or he could not hear. He disappeared into the thick, billowing black smoke that was pouring from the great open doors of the barn. For a moment, Aoife was frozen, paralyzed by a terror so absolute it stole the air from her lungs. Then her own survival instincts, honed by a lifetime of hardship, took over. She ran to the well, her bare feet stumbling on the cold, hard-packed earth. She worked the pump with frantic, desperate energy, her heart hammering against her ribs. She filled a bucket and ran toward the barn, but she was still yards away when the intense, blistering heat drove her back. She threw the water, a pathetic, useless splash against the raging wall of flame. She knew it was hopeless. She could only stand and watch in horror, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the smoke-choked doorway where her husband had vanished. A moment later, two of their horses, Daisy and the younger gelding, burst from the smoke, their eyes wide with terror, their coats singed. Elias was right behind them, swatting at their flanks, driving them toward the safety of the far pasture. He was coughing, his face black with soot. But he was alive. Relief washed over Aoife so powerfully her knees went weak, but her relief was short-lived. He turned and, without a moment's hesitation, plunged back into the burning barn for the last horse, his prized stallion, Zeus. It was then that she heard it, a terrible, groaning crack of timber from within the inferno, a heavy burning beam from the hayloft, weakened by the flames, crashed down. And then she heard a scream. It was not the terrified cry of a horse, it was a human sound, a short, sharp cry of pure agony that was cut off abruptly. And then there was silence, a silence more terrifying than the roar of the fire. The main entrance to the barn, where Elias had just entered, was now completely blocked by the fallen, burning beam. A primal fear, colder and more terrible than the hunger in Ireland, colder than the foreman's grasp in Boston, seized Aoife by the throat. She could not lose him. She had lost everything else in her life, her family, her home, her past. She would not lose him. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a love so fierce it burned away all fear, Aoife acted, her mind, suddenly sharp and clear in the chaos, remembered a small, seldom-used side door on the far side of the barn, a door they used for pitching out old straw. She ran to the woodpile and grabbed the heavy wood-splitting axe, its weight familiar and solid in her hands. She raced around the building, the intense heat blistering the skin on the side of her face, the air so hot it was painful to breathe. She found the door, its wood swollen and hot from the flames. She began to hack at it with all her might, screaming his name over and over, her voice a raw, desperate litany. "Elias! Elias!" The wood splintered and cracked under her furious assault. She put her shoulder into it, and the door finally burst open. The scene inside was a vision of hell. The air was a suffocating, choking soup of black smoke and swirling red embers that stung her eyes and seared her lungs. She could barely see, could barely breathe. She stumbled inside, her eyes streaming, calling his name. And then she saw him. He was pinned to the ground under the smoldering, heavy beam, his left leg crushed and bent at an unnatural angle. There was a deep, bleeding gash on his forehead, and he was trying desperately, weakly, to push the immense weight off himself. His movements were slow, fading. She rushed to him and tried to lift the beam herself, her fingers burning on the hot, charred wood. It would not budge. It was impossibly heavy. "Go!" he choked out, a rattle of smoke and pain in his lungs. His eyes, when they met hers, were clouded with agony. "Save yourself! Aoife, go!" She refused to listen. She would not leave him here to die. Looking around wildly, her eyes scanning the fiery chaos for anything that could help. She saw a long iron pry bar leaning against the wall, a tool they used for moving rocks. With a surge of strength born of pure desperation, she grabbed it. It was heavy, but she managed to wedge one end of it under the massive beam, close to his body. She put her entire weight, her entire will, her entire love for this man into it, using a smaller rock as a fulcrum. The beam lifted, just an inch, just enough. "Now, Elias, crawl!" she shrieked, her muscles screaming with the strain. He used his arms and his one good leg, dragging his broken body out from under the immense weight. The moment he was clear, she let the pry bar drop with a clang. She grabbed him under the arms, her small frame straining, and hauled him, half-conscious and moaning in pain, out of the burning structure. They had just cleared the doorway when the main roof of the barn finally gave way, collapsing inward with a deafening roar and sending a volcanic shower of sparks and flaming debris high into the night sky. She dragged him a safe distance away and collapsed beside him in the dirt, her strength utterly gone. She was sobbing, great, gasping, uncontrollable sobs, her body shaking as if she were the one who was broken. She cradled his bleeding head in her lap, rocking back and forth, her tears washing streaks through the soot on his face. They lay there, illuminated by the dying, malevolent glow of their ruined hopes, surrounded by the smoking ashes of their future. In the days that followed, a bleak, silent despair settled over the ranch. The barn was a heap of charred, skeletal rubble that smoked for 2 days. Most of their winter hay was gone, turned to black ash. Several of the newborn calves, huddled in a pen beside the barn for warmth, had perished in the fire. Elias lay in their bed, consumed by a raging fever, his leg badly broken and burned. Aoife tended to him tirelessly. She was his nurse, his provider, his entire world. She cleaned and dressed his wounds, her touch gentle despite the trembling of her own hands. She forced spoonful after spoonful of thin broth between his cracked lips. But she knew, with a sinking heart, that a deeper wound had been inflicted, a wound to his spirit. When the fever finally broke and his mind was clear, he was a different man. The quiet strength was gone, replaced by a hollow, dead-eyed brokenness. He believed he had failed her completely. He had brought her to this desolate, dangerous place, made her promises of a home and a life, only to lead her to utter ruin. The physical scars on his face were nothing compared to the deep, internal scar of this failure. One morning, when his mind was clear and his voice was almost steady, he pushed her hand away as she tried to give him a drink. He would not meet her eyes. He stared at a crack in the log wall above her head, his face a mask of cold despair. "You have to leave, Aoife," he told her, his voice a dead, hollow thing, devoid of all emotion. "There is nothing left here. Croft has won. Go back east. Go back to Boston. Find a safe life. I release you from this bargain." He was trying to save her, trying to do the only honorable thing he thought he had left to do. But his words were like a knife in her heart. He was erasing everything they had become to each other. He was reducing their love, their partnership, their shared dreams back to a simple, sordid transaction, a contract that he could no longer uphold. Aifa looked at this defeated man, this shadow of the strong, resilient partner she had grown to love. All the grief, the terror, the exhaustion, and the silent fury of the past days coalesced inside her into a core of pure, unshakable strength. Her voice, when she finally spoke, did not tremble. It did not plead. It rang through the quiet, grief-stricken cabin with the clarity and strength of a steel bell. "Release me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. She leaned over him, her face close to his, forcing him to look at her. "You think this is about a bargain? About this land? About a barn?" Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, blazed with a fire that dwarfed the one that had destroyed their barn. "I survived the hunger that took my family. I survived the crossing in a ship that was not fit for cattle. I survived the filth and the cruelty of the city and the hands of men who thought they could own me." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I am not a delicate flower. Elias Thorne. I am a survivor. And I did not survive all of that just to be defeated by one greedy, cowardly man and a pile of ash." She put her hands on his shoulders, her grip surprisingly strong. "This is my home. You are my husband, and we do not run. We fight." Her voice dropped to an intense, unwavering command. "Now, you will lie there, and you will drink this broth, and you will heal. You will heal because I am not finished with you yet." Her declaration was not just a refusal to leave, it was a battle cry. It was the moment she became the undeniable anchor of their relationship, her strength a lifeline thrown to him in the abyss of his despair. It was the moment she took up the fight for both of them. Aoife's fierce declaration, spoken into the despairing silence of the cabin, was not merely a collection of words, it was a force of nature. It was the moment the tide turned, not against their enemies, but within the walls of their own hearts. Her strength became his. Her unshakable will became the scaffolding upon which he could begin to rebuild his own shattered spirit. While Elias began the slow, painful process of healing, his body locked in a battle against fever and his broken bones, Aoife took charge of what was left of the ranch. She became a whirlwind of relentless, focused energy. Her profound grief and white-hot anger were not allowed to fester. Instead, she channeled them into grueling, back-breaking labor. She rose before the sun, her small frame a silhouette against the gray dawn, and worked until long after darkness fell. She sifted through the charred, stinking debris of the barn, her hands raw and black with soot, salvaging anything that had survived the inferno, a few scorched tools, a set of iron chains, a half-melted branding iron. She tended to the remaining livestock with a fierce, maternal devotion, her voice a low, soothing murmur as she treated their burns and calmed their skittish nerves. She rationed their dwindling supplies with a fierce efficiency, making every grain of flour, every strip of jerky, last. Her small frame seemed to contain an inexhaustible well of energy, a fire that burned even brighter than the one that had sought to destroy them. From his bed by the window, Elias watched her. He watched as she single-handedly wrangled a calf that had gotten tangled in a downed section of fence. He watched as she split firewood, her movements now sure and practiced. He watched her in the evenings, her face illuminated by the lamplight, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination as she mended their clothes. He watched, and he was consumed by a complex and overwhelming mixture of awe, profound shame at his own helplessness, and a rekindling love so powerful it was a physical ache in his chest. He saw that her strength was not a rejection of him, but a testament to her love for him, and for the life they had built together. She was not just surviving, she was fighting for them. He knew then that he had to fight too. He started to force down the broth she offered. He began the agonizing exercises to keep the muscles in his good leg from wasting away. He started to fight his way back, not just for himself, but for her. They knew they needed justice, but the path to it seemed impossibly barred. The law in redemption was a cruel joke, a tool bought and paid for by Silas Croft, as Elias had predicted. Sheriff Gable had ridden out a few days after the fire, his expression one of bored indifference. He had poked at the ashes with the toe of his boot, declared it a tragic accident, perhaps a misplaced lantern, a stray spark, and had ridden away without taking a single note. They were on their own. Their hope for justice seemed as remote and inaccessible as the distant, snow-capped mountains on the horizon. But their isolation was not as complete as they believed. The day after the fire, Aoife had ridden the mare into town, her face set like stone, and had returned with Dr. Adams. The town's elderly physician was a man of quiet, unshakable integrity. He had set Elias's leg with practiced, gentle hands, his face a mask of professional calm, but his eyes, when they met Aoife's, were full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. He had known Elias his whole life, had seen the boy grow into a haunted, solitary man, and he had seen the subtle, positive changes in him since Aoife's arrival. As he was leaving, he had taken Aoife's hand in his own dry, papery one. "This was no accident, my dear," he had said, his voice a low whisper. "You be careful. If you need anything, you send word." He had become their silent, cautious ally, a single, small glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness. The key to that hope came from the ashes themselves. Weeks later, when Elias was just beginning to move around the cabin on a crude, hand-carved crutch, Aoife was making one last pass through the debris field of the barn. She was searching for anything, a lost buckle, a nail, anything of use. As her fingers sifted through a pile of charred wood and cold ash, they closed around something hard, cool, and metallic. It felt completely out of place. She pulled it out and wiped it on her skirt. It was a unique, custom-made silver lighter, tarnished by the smoke but otherwise intact. On its smooth surface, an elegant, curling monogram was engraved, the initials is C. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized it instantly. She had a photographic memory for details, and she could see it as clearly as if it were yesterday. Silas Croft, standing in the general store, flipping the lid of this very lighter open with a flick of his thumb to light a thin cigarillo. He must have dropped it that night, in his haste or his arrogance. It was the proof. It was the tangible link between him and this devastating act of evil. But she also knew, with a sinking feeling, that it was still just their word, the word of the town outcasts, against the most powerful and influential man in the county. That evening, she showed it to Elias. He turned it over and over in his hands, his face grim. The hope that had flared in her was tempered by the cold reality in his eyes. "It is something," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "But it is not enough. Gable will say we planted it. Croft will deny it is his. We need more than this lighter. We need to force a public confrontation." And so, in the quiet of their cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of their ruined hopes, they began to formulate a dangerous plan. Their only line to the outside world was Dr. Adams. The next time he rode out to check on Elias's leg, they showed him the lighter and confided in him their desperate idea. The doctor listened patiently, his brow furrowed in thought. He agreed that the lighter alone was not enough, but he told them something that made their plan begin to take shape. Silas Croft, arrogant and secure in his victory, was hosting a large gathering at the town saloon in a week's time. He was celebrating a lucrative new cattle deal. A deal, the doctor surmised, that was likely predicated on the cattle he planned to acquire once he finally forced Elias off his land. "The whole town will be there," the doctor said. "All the ranchers, the mayor, the merchants. If you are ever going to make a stand, that will be your only chance." The night of the gathering, the saloon in Redemption was crowded and smoky, filled with the loud talk and laughter of men drinking to Silas Croft's success. The air was thick with the smells of whiskey, cheap perfume, and cigar smoke. Croft himself stood at the bar, holding court, accepting congratulations, his handsome face flushed with drink and triumph. The swinging doors of the saloon creaked open, and a sudden, tense silence fell over the room. Elias and Aoife entered together. They were a startling, dramatic sight. Elias, gaunt and pale from his convalescence, leaned heavily on a rough wooden crutch, his scarred face a mask of grim, implacable purpose. Beside him stood Aoife, her small frame radiating a cold, resolute strength that seemed to make her taller, her expression unreadable. Croft turned, a slow, contemptuous sneer spreading across his lips as he took in the sight of his broken rival. "Well, look what the fire dragged in," he drawled, his voice carrying through the silent room. "Come to beg Thorn, a little late for that." Elias ignored him, his clear gray eyes sweeping across the faces of the men in the room. He spoke, and his voice, though not loud, was clear and strong, cutting through the smoky air with the authority of absolute conviction. "A fire did not drag me in," he said. "Arson did." He raised his hand and pointed a trembling but steady finger directly at Silas Croft. "The fire that destroyed my barn, my livelihood, and nearly killed me, was set by that man." A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a wave of nervous murmurs. Croft laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "The man is crazed by his misfortune. He is looking for someone to blame. He has no proof." "Oh, but we do," Aoife said, her voice cutting through the noise like a shard of glass. She stepped forward, out of Elias's shadow, and opened her hand. In her palm lay the tarnished silver lighter. She held it up for all to see. "You were careless, Mr. Croft. You dropped this." Croft's face, which had been flushed with victory, went deathly pale. He instinctively, involuntarily, patted the pocket of his waistcoat, a dead giveaway that was not lost on the men watching. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Gable, his face red and flustered, started to step forward, ready to dismiss the claim, to protect his benefactor. But before he could speak, a calm, authoritative voice spoke up from the back of the room. "I can attest that Mrs. Thorn found that lighter in the ashes of her barn." It was Dr. Adams. He stood near the door, his arms crossed. "I was at the ranch tending to her husband's injuries he sustained while being trapped in that very fire." The doctor's word carried a weight that the sheriff's did not. He was a man respected by all. The murmurs in the room grew louder, more uncertain. And then, the final piece of their desperate plan fell into place. Reverend Miller, the preacher, who had been standing in the corner looking deeply troubled, stepped forward. He was wrestling with his conscience, shaken by a confession he had heard just days before, and by his own earlier cruelty to Aoife. He saw a chance, not just for justice, but for his own redemption. "The doctor speaks the truth," the preacher announced, his voice booming with ecclesiastical authority. "But there is more. A young man who works for Mr. Croft, his soul tormented by guilt, confessed his part in this sin to me." All eyes were now on the preacher. "He told me that Mr. Croft forced him to help set the fire, threatening his family if he refused." The saloon erupted. The revelation, confirmed by both the town's doctor and its preacher, was undeniable. The tide of public opinion, so long running against Elias and Aoife, turned with the sudden, violent force of a flash flood. The townspeople, faced with the undeniable proof of Croft's villainy and a conspiracy of silence, felt the sting of their own complicity, their own willingness to believe the worst of the outcasts. Their fear of Croft was replaced by a righteous, furious anger. In the ensuing chaos, Croft, seeing that he was utterly ruined, made one last, desperate move. He drew a pistol from inside his coat, but Elias, anticipating it, moved with a speed that belied his injury. He swung his heavy wooden crutch in a low, powerful arc, sweeping Croft's legs out from under him. Croft crashed to the floor, and the pistol clattered across the wooden planks. The confrontation was over, not with a blaze of heroic gunfire, but with the pathetic, ignominious downfall of a bully. Before he could scramble for the gun, a group of ranchers, their faces grim with anger, were on him, pinning him to the floor. The sheriff, now powerless to protect him, simply stood by, his face ashen. Justice rough and immediate, had been served. The final part of their story unfolded not in violence and fear, but in healing and hope. Silas Croft was gone, his land and assets seized to pay his considerable debts and to provide restitution for the damages he had caused. With his malign influence removed, the town of Redemption began to live up to its name. Elias and Aoife were no longer outcasts. They were now respected, even admired, members of the community, symbols of courage and resilience. The people who had once shunned them now came forward to offer their help. A rancher from the south donated a half-dozen head of cattle to help them rebuild their herd. The owner of the mercantile extended them unlimited credit, his face a study in shame and apology. But most importantly, the people of the town came together to help them rebuild the barn. It was a communal effort, a physical symbol of their acceptance and healing. Men who had once whispered behind their hands now worked side by side with Elias, raising the timbers, hammering the planks. The women of the town brought food and drink, sitting with Aoife, their chatter and laughter a new and welcome sound on the once silent ranch. The story ends many months later, in the full, glorious bloom of the following spring. A new, sturdier barn stood proudly on the foundation of the old one, its fresh pine boards smelling of sap and new beginnings. The ranch was scarred, but it was recovering, just like its owners. Elias walked without a crutch now. His limp was permanent, a part of him he would carry forever. But it was no longer a mark of shame. It was a testament to his survival, a reminder of the fire they had walked through together. He and Aoife stood on the small porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over their land, painting the sky in soft hues of lavender and rose. The cabin was no longer stark. There were cheerful yellow curtains on the windows, sewn by the women of the town, and a small porch swing that Elias had built himself, a place for them to sit together in the cool of the evenings. Aoife's hand rested on her slightly swollen belly, a gentle, protective gesture. There were no grand declarations of love, no dramatic pronouncements. They were not necessary anymore. They simply stood together in the quiet twilight, his arm wrapped securely around her, her head resting on his shoulder. They had faced the absolute worst the world had to offer, and they had not only survived, they had triumphed. Their love, forged in a humiliating transaction, tempered in the fires of tragedy, and solidified in a defiant stand for justice, had become their unshakable foundation. The final image is one of quiet, resilient, and hard-won peace, the promise of a future built not on a single tarnished dollar, but on a love that was, and would always be, utterly priceless. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.